3. Hey everybody, Kumar Train here with Meridian, joined by Glenn Marshall, and we are here to continue our discussion on the permaculture principles and their similarity to, and actually their inspiration, the inspiration that they had on the X-scale ecosystem principles. And I believe we're up to principles 9 and 10 in this episode. Is that right, Glenn?
That is correct.
Right. And so we will start with principle 9, and we'll start with a permaculture principle 9. And what that says is use small and slow solutions. And so maybe a brief, what does that mean to you from a permaculture standpoint, Glenn?
It brings to mind small scale farming as opposed to massive industrial scale farming, and how a series of small farms will have a lot of diversity and a lot of difference and variation, whereas large industrial farms, of course, are monoculture, hundreds of thousands of acres of a single crop, hundreds of thousands of cows, for example, that sort of thing. And we do know from agriculture that there are serious consequences for that. You need a ton of fertilizer, for example, and they're very specialized and kind of fragile. If you only have cows, for example, and this doesn't happen with cows so much, but chickens, bird flu will decimate you if you only have one specialty, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously we have a huge population on Earth to feed. And so permaculture argues for small farms and small scale and slow over fast. And I just wonder how realistic it is, feeding 7 billion, 8 billion. I don't even know how many humans there are on the planet anymore. It seems to keep growing every year.
I have that concern as well. I do wonder about the cost per unit of output as well. But when you start to go down that path, if you're serious about optimizing food for the entire planet, you'll recognize that meat is a dreadfully inefficient way of using agricultural land. And to your first point about population, it is growing, but it's going to start dropping very, very fast, very, very soon. China's population has peaked, for example, which is pretty shocking. But of course, they had the one-child policy. But all major developed countries are experiencing declining population, and the only way that some countries are increasing is through immigration.
Right. Well, it seems to me that the small and slow is a more sustainable model. Obviously, everything about permaculture is about more sustainability and more effective use of resources and more effective use of agriculture, planting techniques, not planting things that require a lot of water and resources, or when you do and if you do, planting complementary crops that will preserve the soil and preserve the balance in the soil, right? So you don't need to put a lot of fertilizers and things like that in. But this also requires, from a permaculture perspective, a lot of planning, a lot of thinking, a lot of coordination, and between nations, inside of nations and between nations to make this work. And so, again, that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But I wonder if there's a future in which we can actually put these practices to play and see how they can help the planet be more sustainable and still have enough food to feed the population.
Well, you bring up a good point. I think all of the principles applied across the board to all farms is not going to work. However, soil depletion is a thing, and it's serious, and it's a problem. And industrial farming has historically not paid much attention to that, and the soil is not in good shape. This can be easily dealt with through permaculture principles, through something as simple as crop rotation. There are large crops that you could have, you just rotate them. So it's not that hard to go and do some of these things. Another phenomenon is no-till agriculture, where you don't plow. That has a lot of nasty downside, and large farms are not doing that. The whole organic movement as well. So some things are definitely applicable.
And there's a statistic that the world will run out of topsoil in 60 years.
There you go.
60 years. It's not within my lifetime, unless I live to be 120, but it's within my kids' lifetime, 60 years. right? And what does that mean for the food supply? Are we depleting ourselves out of a way to feed the population, you know? And so the parallels, of course, to the organizational culture, the companies that we coach, in principle 9 of the ecosystem thinking principles, it says, take time to simplify and automate systems. Simple automated solutions cost less than big manual ones, taking less work to maintain business advantages. So help me draw some parallels between permaculture principle, use small and slow solutions, to the ecosystem thinking principle of taking time to simplify, automate. Simple is better than complex.
I don't think the tie-in is quite as strong as it's been on some of the other principles, but there are some connections there. Who would disagree with automation, particularly if you're talking information technology? Clearly, that's better, less errors, and so on and so forth. But let me give another example. Look what happened with COVID. Big, highly optimized supply chains, but also a single point of failure. They were super big and they had a single point of failure. And now there's been a major movement away from massive, widely dispersed supply chains to some more local ones, and definitely some more diverse ones where there's multiple options in case you run into a problem with a country halfway around the world. So I think that's a good example of being too big and too complicated. And when you get really big, you have to add all kinds of things on top of the bigness to keep the bigness working. So there is a thing about economy of scale. I get it. Nobody's going to make a chip manufacturing plant in their backyard. But definitely there are times when we have gotten carried away with it rather. And really what you want is a phrase from Agile, the simplest thing that would possibly work. And notions like minimum viable product. Just get something out there, find out what the need is, make it simple, get it out there, rather than over-engineering it and making a needlessly large product or factory or whatever it is.
Yeah. And another way to maybe think about the relationship, between these two, permaculture and the ecosystem thinking principles is, in permaculture, it's obviously small and slow, small farms, sustainable farming methods, rotation of crops, preserving of topsoil, elimination or severe reduction in pesticide and fertilizer use, all those things, right? And the analogy might be, you have a company with 200-person teams working on these huge projects that require lots of resources, lots of people, the 200 people that are working on the project, of course, plus all the people that support them, all the business analysts and so on and so forth. That's big. And they may only release once every 18 months. And so you've got these big releases with lots of bugs and lots of errors in the code and so on and so forth, where the opposite, the simple version of that would be small power teams that are using automated systems to develop, test, and deploy their code, automated systems that integrate that code with other teams and the work that they're doing. Those are much more efficient. The errors are much more easily and readily found and fixed. Maybe that's a better way to think about the relationship between these two.
I think it is, and that gets into the whole open source movement. In various sectors of the software industry, commercial software simply doesn't exist. Linux, of course, is pretty much running the data center these days. That's free software. Now, of course, you can get warranties with it and so on and so forth. The example I often use is Unix was invented by two very bright guys, I admit, in a lab, but just two guys. That was it. Yeah. They made an operating system, and that, of course, exists in Linux today. And Unix variants are the source of all major computing environments today, except for Windows, although it was influenced as well. But the Mac, the iPhone, the Android, they're all running this, as well as in the data center. So Tesla, these small units, in fact, are resilient. They're fault tolerant, but they can scale through replication. So it's just not a monolith, I think, is the point here.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's move to principle 10. So on the ecosystem, the permaculture side, it states, use and value diversity. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. You want to take a stab at describing what that means? I mean, beyond the words that I just said.
There's an angle there that I'd like to drill in on, and it was at all scales in all ways. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just diversity, for example, with the crops, but it's diversity as you scale up, as you have networks of other things working together. Diversity in culture, diversity in everything, in every way, at every level. And I thought that was a powerful concept. And really, that's kind of the way the world works. There's diversity everywhere. Of course, companies, for example, chip manufacturing companies, they kind of have to scale, but there's risk there when you only have a single, when the economy of scale forces you to have a lack of diversity, frankly. So it's a powerful notion, and I think this one lies more strongly than Principle 9.
Yeah, I agree. So diversity in permaculture, to your point, is you mentioned it, right? It's not just about the crops you plant and so on and so forth, but it's really, if you take a step back and look at the ecosystem that is the Earth. I mean, it's incredibly diverse, in spite of what humans have been doing to it over the last few hundred years. But it's still incredibly diverse. We're making it less so, right? There are zones where, especially in the ocean, where it's devoid of life, right, because of the things that we've done. But another topic, I don't want to go down that path. But in terms of the analogy to organizational culture, and the principle there is use and value experimentation, experiment to reduce risk, adapt each product to the changing constraints of your business streams and markets. So where do you see diversity and this idea of experimentation? Where's the synergy there?
I'd like to make a slightly different point, if I may, just before I answer that. Diversity is a sign of health.
Mm-hmm.
You may need to be big, for example, the chip plant, but that's not really healthy, and there's risk and exposure there. So we really want to go and have as much diversity as we can. And in terms of experimentation, that's a great way to get diversity. You have a product, you are trying to go and come up with some new features. You're not completely sure how you're going to do that, or you want to try a couple of experiments. Perfect. That's a way to introduce diversity. It's also a way to introduce innovative thinking. The critical point in terms of experimentation for me is, as long as you show up and you put a good faith effort into it, and you follow some basic practices around an experiment, there's no such thing as failure. Failure is actually not failure. It's just data. We tried that, it didn't work. Don't do that anymore. That is actually very valuable. And having that culture and that mindset that it's just data is very, very powerful. And all kinds of wonderful things come from teams and organizations that are not afraid to experiment, including diversity.
Yeah, I like that. In terms of scale, permaculture, of course, is much broader, right? It can focus on diversity across whole systems, social, biological realms, genetic variants, and so on and so forth. Ecosystem really is about helping organizations think of their specific products and services that they provide the markets, and adapting to those markets, making use of maybe new niches within the marketplace, and creating products and services to serve those niches, again, like to your point, through experimentation. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I see an alignment between these two.
But also within the organization itself, treat the organization as an ecosystem. Finance is there to service financially the various parts of the organization, legal and so on. And we want to integrate them more tightly rather than have them siloed, like is often the case.
Right. Yeah, that speaks to the mindset, right, within the organization, that the mindset needs to change, that these aren't siloed departments within an organization. They need to think about how to integrate their work with other departments, divisions in the company, rapidly prototype, experiment, learn from failure, and so on.
Yeah, they're valuable parts of the organization, and they can best deliver their value by connecting in an ecosystem-like fashion.
Right. All right. Awesome. I think anything we missed about either of these two?
I don't think so. These are relatively straightforward. There is one thing that maybe we did gloss over, and that is resilience and adaptability. Through experimentation and diversity makes you resilient and of course healthy. So multiple benefits from experimentation. The world is always changing. If you're not experimenting and moving with it, you're falling behind.
That's a good point. All right. Well, we are almost at the end of our permaculture principles. We've got 2 more to go, 11 and 12, and then we will decide where to go after that in terms of educating you all on Xscale. So thank you for watching. We will see you in about a month. Appreciate you joining us this evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.